Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, as always, joining you for our latest edition of our weekly podcast that we release every single Thursday. This Thursday's podcast is one focused on outplacement and the process of when somebody sort of exits a business. At Lace, we have a model that we talk about, and it almost sits within the wish me well, as we call it. I'll get one of my colleagues to talk about that in a minute. But yeah, as I said, today is about outplacement. I have two lovely guests and one lovely co-host with me, and it's Debbie Mitchell who is co-hosting. So I'll introduce Debbie first. How are you doing, Des? You all right?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. Lovely to be here again.
It is lovely to have you on, and lovely to have you by my side as we ask we love it again. As we ask the critical questions in all things to do with outplacement. Exactly. And let's introduce the other Lacer before we go into our external guests. It's Ffion Bennett, who works at Lace in our team. Ffion, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm making my podcast debut today, so I'm very excited.
You are, and I'm going to give you a lovely, fundamentally different question in a minute to kick us off. But before we do that, let's introduce Susan Binnersley, who is the director at H2H Limited. Susan, how are you doing?
I'm fabulous today. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me on your podcast.
Oh, thank you for coming on. Now, Susan, we're going to ask a fundamentally different question. But before I get into that, can you just tell our lovely listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, if that's all right?
Yeah, of course it is. So I'm currently the managing director of H2H Resources, and we are a consultancy that helps businesses be more successful through their people. So quite often that involves some sort of leadership development and engagement, because more often than not, if you talk to anybody about problems in their business, they'll start talking about a manager. So we figure if we equip those people to really enhance the working lives of their teams, then everybody benefits, including the business. So we spend a lot of time in that place, but we also have different services, one of which is outplacement. And as you've already said, that's where we're helping people who are facing redundancy. Weirdly, the word redundancy is often not used when people describe outplacement, but I'm from Yorkshire, we say it as it is. When people are being made redundant, they're being asked to leave an organisation, well, not even asked, they're being told to leave an organisation, one of life's top 5 most stressful events, and we provide a great service to help them through that journey to their next career step. So that's kind of why I'm here today. I also have an industrial background. I was an HR director in industry and worked in industry for over 20 years before becoming a consultant.
Lovely, jubbly. So as we talked about, and I touched about, and then you've just touched about, Susan, today's really focused on that outplacement bit. And it's a podcast that we haven't actually, I don't think we've done. I mean, I should really remember whether we've done, but we have done over 160 of these podcasts, so I don't remember all of them. But just as a bit of a framing exercise, at the time of us recording, it's February. We've had a period of probably uncertainty that stretches back way into 2023. And again, at the time of recording, there's a lot of news which has just come out talking about the Body Shop and how they've gone into administration. So there's potentially, it's a large organisation that's going to have a number of jobs. I think it's 7,000 or 8,000 jobs which are potentially at risk. And that really brought to light when we were talking about this beforehand, when we were sort of prepping for this podcast, the importance of understanding outplacement and the value it can add, and, what happens when you get it right. So we're going to get into some of those questions, and we are going to talk about, as I mentioned, that wish me well, which is why we've got the fabulous Ffion joining us. But fundamentally different question first, because there are so many redundancies, because we have businesses that are potentially, we've heard about lots of businesses going out of business. I wanted to pick, and I'll start with you, Susan. I want you to pick one business that one brand that if it left the high street, you simply couldn't do without. You would be forever sad. So what would be that one brand that you cannot do without?
Gosh, well, cannot do without could be quite extreme. I'm going to say I'll be a sad loss. When I think about it and look at myself in the mirror today, I'm going to have to say Hobbs, because I think I've got about 4 Hobbs garments on. And as Debbie knows, I have a bit of a hurry-up driver in my life. I like to do everything efficiently, and I know Hobbs suits me. I know what size I need. I can go in and get stuff that I just love, and it lasts forever. So
love it. Absolutely love it. So if anybody from Hobbs is listening, please continue to be robust and add value, and continue to deliver value to Susan as well. Ffion.
Controversial, Amazon. I use it so much. I wouldn't know what to do. Like, how would I order matches or batteries for the next day?
Well, I was about to say go to Wilkins, go to Wilco, but you can't do that anymore.
Exactly, Chris. So
exactly, yeah. Debbie, what would you choose?
At the current time of recording, and that basically demonstrates that I'll probably change my mind every 5 minutes. Deliveroo, I'm not a big takeaway eater, but I am a big panicker because I didn't do any shopping when I should have. And at the moment I've run out of milk, I'm straight onto Deliveroo to buy groceries and all the other things that you need or you didn't need when you thought you needed milk. So you end up paying £500 for milk, a packet of biscuits, some jelly snakes and other things that you don't need.
Yes, indeed. So we are missing Deliveroo, Amazon and Hobbs. Please, for the sake of the podcasters today, can we keep those brands going strong? So, Ffion, I'm going to kick off with you before I get Debbie to ask the first question to Susan about particularly around the outplacement side. But can you just talk to our listeners a little bit about our models and our EX model that we have, and particularly when we talk about the Wish Me Well, because it's quite relevant to this part of the conversation today, isn't it?
Of course. So, as regular listeners will know, in LACE, we have our holistic employee experience wheel, which attempts to illustrate how each part of an employee journey or the HR life cycle is just as important as the traditional ones that we would consider, which would be the onboarding and promotion type elements. But each element across the wheel actually has a significant impact on the individual's life and ultimately their experience with their employer. So I think a few years back, CPOs and HR teams would gasp at me if I was saying that we need to focus the experience on a leader process or what we call the Wish Me Well process. And this experience, more so in the last few years, really needs to be critical, because with the ever-growing blasting we're seeing on social media about how some companies are just really doing it very badly, it can significantly damage their reputation as an employer, but also as a brand themselves. You know, organizations may not want to partner or work with them if they see a particular bad press example. And we have all seen that TikTok, which I shan't mention the name, but it has gone viral, about how a redundancy can go very badly. And really, my final point is, so not only thinking about someone exiting the organisation, but thinking about when people do actually return as well. I think most companies would actually really welcome back ex-employees with their experience from what they've learned at competitors or different industries. So we want to encourage that and think about how nice it is to actually have a conversation with someone in our life that say, oh yeah, LACE were an excellent employer. I really enjoyed my time there. And actually, I'm still in contact with a couple of my team. And you don't realise the power of that and how quickly word of mouth can spread. So that is why we see Wish Me Well as a big focus area.
Yeah, it's a real advocacy point, right? So it's not just about we want you to come back, it's who are you talking to, and that affects the broader brand, not just the employer brand. So yeah, thanks Ffion for taking us through that. I think it really highlights why it really matters. And I guess then the preemptive question to that is about how do we make sure that Wish Me Well experience is a positive or respectful one, that actually you can leave the organization feeling still like you've been treated well, even though the situation may not be ideal. And, you know, Susan, that's why we sort of wanted your expertise, I think, from sort of both angles, actually, because I know you've had experience of working as a CPO and, you know, overseeing some of those difficult programs, but also now sort of offering that outplacement support. So we're wondering kind of how would you describe some of that process at each end, sort of the redundancy process and then the outplacement process? How would you describe those?
So the redundancy process, for me, that just needs to be super clear. I think you used the word dignity, respect. And certainly when I was in industry, HR is a complex field. You can't possibly know all the legal ins and outs. So my mantra to myself, even from day one, as way back in 1987, obviously I was a child worker.
Child prodigy.
But even back then, I just thought, I'm grateful to my family. I feel as though I've got a strong sense of fairness and respect. So I always thought, if I can treat all of those people that I interact with that sense of fairness and dignity and respect, with my HR hat on, then I'll be doing my job well, and can I sleep well at night? So when I was in the middle of that, and I think I'm scared to add it all up, but I think I've probably been involved in making over 10,000 people redundant in my career when I was a CPO. So it's a lot of people. So for me, that redundancy process, when you're managing it, I think you almost have to distance yourself a little bit in terms of managing the process, and accept that, yes, you can do a lot to support the employees, but ultimately you're the one administrating this difficult task. And sometimes that's why the HR community amongst themselves need to support each other, because it's a tough gig. Yeah. So there's an element of, let's just work together. I think the other thing that's always worth talking to people about is there's a legal process. If you're making a certain number of people redundant, you're actually told how to do it. And that legal process in itself requires consultation, rightly so. But that also means you can't always answer everybody's questions with the agility you might want to if you were making a smaller number. So I think the process can feel quite formal. My big ask of any CPO on this call, and any manager who is translating the CPO kind of directive of we've got to make people redundant, more often it's people's line managers who communicate the news. My big ask is, for goodness sake, communicate really clearly, and that so no two people can disagree, back it up in writing, keep it simple. The amount of times when I was in industry where I knew managers were having to brief people about, you are being made redundant, this is the process, this is the date, and you'd have those where people come back to you and say, my managers talked to me, and I'm like, well, what did they say? Well, they said they weren't sure if they had any need for my future skills in this organisation. It was all fluffy language. People were avoiding saying, you are now at risk of redundancy. So I think that process, sadly, it needs to be quite firm. It needs to be very clear, I think. And that being clear is being kind.
Yeah, we had a mantra in one of the programs I was involved in as well, that one of the general managers kind of instigated, which was communicate, communicate, communicate. And when you think you've communicated, go back and communicate again. And it's a really kind of simple thing that just says, actually, you can't tell people enough. I mean, you don't want to ram home a difficult message, but to your point, clarity is kindness. And you do want to be really clear with people about what is happening to them.
Yeah, I might have my stats wrong, but I remember reading at some point, when people are receiving difficult news, they are able to process only about 20% of it accurately. So if you bear that in mind, no matter how clear you are. So your mantra was a good one.
What about the outplacement side then, Susan? So talk us through a bit about what you see as outplacement. Where does that fit?
So for me, outplacement is, I would encourage everybody to offer it. Even if, you were talking about Body Shop earlier on, people are making these tough decisions quite often because of financials. Sometimes it's part of a business, but it doesn't have to cost the earth. And I would just want certainly every HR practitioner who's involved in any sort of redundancy process to just think, what's the art of the possible with this redundancy? And I've always been quite surprised that sometimes I've met HR professionals who don't even know what outplacement is. Just making sure people know that supporting people through their exit is a really great thing to do for a number of reasons, which we can always explore a bit later on in this podcast. So I think just making sure people know that it's available. Once people start organising outplacement, there's actually quite a surprising amount of free resources. If you're an organisation that has trade unions, they're often a great support as well and have actual resources. So for me, there's just wanting to make everybody aware that outplacement can be super accessible. And for me, outplacement is some external people potentially, well, always normally, to help somebody on that difficult journey from getting the news of I'm being made redundant to very quickly knowing they'll have some support through to that journey when they start the next phase of their career, or they decide to retire or have a different choices. So for me, it's that accompany them on that journey.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. And what I think is interesting as well is, and Ffion, I'd love to get your views on this too, this idea that you've got an organisation that has an outplacement programme approach. I'd love to get your views, Ffion, and then Susan, around the importance of going back to that communication point, because it's not just HR's responsibility, is it, to be able to drive, we've got this outplacement service, sorry you're losing your job, or sorry that we're making you redundant, but there you go, we're going to push you through that. It's actually incumbent. And there's something around communicating and being confident to communicate to line managers the values of this, and maybe even doing it as a regular thing where it's not something that, oh, look, we've got to deliver bad news, but here's the upside, there's outplacement. There's something to be said around communicating that, even if you're not making mass scale redundancies, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points there. I think the first area is, if they're a good outplacement organisation, they won't just offer support because you've been made redundant. I've seen outplacement organisations that offer, if you're thinking about starting your own business, support in that way. If you'd like to reskill in a different area, support that way. So companies can actually offer it as part of their holistic talent and skills development part. It doesn't necessarily have to have that association with redundancy. So that's nice for an organisation to kind of build a partnership with these types of areas, so that if a instance of redundancy does exist, the individual is already familiar with the types of things it offers. And also, I think people aren't naive, or most people aren't. Redundancies are a fact of life, particularly if you work in specific industries. So people get it. If you have to make redundancies, that's fine. I know a couple of people, I'm sure we all do in our network, that actually have been delighted when they've been made redundant, because they've had very generous packages and it's changed their life because they've gone into a new role and they're very happy with it. So I think it's just to really say, as you are delivering that clear message, you have been made redundant, deliver it how you would deliver your other experience areas, through care and compassion, and show that, yes, we have delivered the formal message. However, me as your manager that knows you as a person, knows your family life, knows your skills, I'm here to support you alongside a structured plan. I think that is what makes a difference. And that is the conversation that employers will want people to have with their network and their family and friends about how they left the organisation.
Susan?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Ffion. I think without placement, there's different scenarios, like you say. I think fundamentally, if we go back to the process, it's the role that is being made redundant. So as Ffion suggests, sometimes there's an opportunity for people to then reskill or point their skills in a different direction internally. If it does mean an external exit, and sometimes people don't have the choice of an internal opportunity, I guess what I can say hand on heart is the outcome is normally, by a huge percentage, ultimately positive for the individual. I remember one of my very first clients who I picked up, absolutely devastated by the news that they were being asked to leave an organisation. And, we explored the rationale behind it. Initially, he just had no understanding or no concept. But through that kind of coaching, a fairly intimate dialogue with somebody in a safe space, he totally revealed why he'd been made redundant. I could see it, clearly the organisation had gone one way. He wasn't skilled enough to do that role anymore. The role had some legal responsibilities that actually terrified him. And so we worked through, and, when I first met him, he was signed off by the doctor. He looked dreadful. He had significant health problems. 3 months later, he had 3 different job offers in sectors he was really well equipped for. He was signed off from the doctor. He looked and spoke like a different person. And, that's an example of what can happen, because quite often I think people actually know, they feel it if they're in a wrong role. So like you said, Ffion, sometimes almost without exception, this can be a good outcome ultimately, but we'd be fooling ourselves if we try and tell people that, and it would be quite cruel to try and tell people that on announcement day. You'll be thanking us for this later. That just ain't going to work. So that's, again, coming back to the respect. This is tough news for people to hear. Let's help them transition through it.
It's interesting, that story, Susan, because it takes us back again to the sort of pre-exit to the process. And what you allude to there really is how critical the line manager's role is. We touched on that sort of at the beginning. So the line manager and the HR team. And again, as you know, I've worked in several teams where we've had to go through similar and seen some opportunity to do things differently. I just wondered what your sort of perspective is on how could HR themselves, but also with line managers or for line managers, help that preparation so that the outcome isn't somebody comes to you and they're a mess, but Outplacement helps them. They come to you really ready to take on that transition.
Yeah, I think the way HR managers can help is to really equip the line managers to lean into and have those conversations. You talked before about communicate some more, and helping them understand that very direct communication is actually helpful. And I guess layer onto that it wouldn't be unusual for that line manager to also be at risk of redundancy. You know, I've managed redundancies when I've been at risk of redundancy before. Yeah. That's a tough ask. So I think HR can also provide a variety of support, or even bring in support. We've been in and actually helped organisations because, again, you know, the very people making redundant, if it's a site closure, it's going to touch everybody, right? From the MD to all of the employees. So I think if HR kind of recognise that this is going to happen, partner with a great outplacement company, and actually there's a dovetailed process that people follow where advice can be shared, but certainly the HR acknowledging where they are in this, acknowledging how they can help the line managers and support them, and then kind of test that out and just make sure they do feel equipped and understand the way to have those conversations, because they're a tough conversation, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. Ffion.
Yeah, again, two angles I wanted to speak about this. The first one is sometimes people look around and realise, how did I become a manager? A manager isn't necessarily an area I feel quite comfortable in doing. And I think that there's a stat which I probably get very wrong, but it's something like only 25% of managers should actually be managers because they have the skills in order to do that. So that's one piece. If you have an organisation or maybe a group of managers that don't naturally fall into that manager space, there needs to be an element of HR being aware of those skill gaps and attempting to upskill or grow that confidence in being able to deliver these types of messages. And then also, from my role, obviously being a manager at Lace and working on lots of different HR transformation projects, I hear a lot, let's drive manager self-service. We want managers to do more of that. Let's have more strategic HR. Let's grow our efficiency in HR. That's all well and good. And, you know, I drive that forward. But we need to take a step back and think, okay, with all these cuts happening as well, line managers are often then doing more roles because their top team have gone or their bottom team have gone. And we do talk about things like, well, our new tools can automate a lot for managers and employees. Okay, but I think very few organisations are actually there yet with the automation of processes. And this just sometimes could feel like another thing that a manager has to do alongside their actual role as well. And I mean, sometimes redundancies and restructuring come out of the blue, but often or not, particularly in large corporates, is often planned a couple of quarters in advance because they have to get the budget sign off. So this isn't something that should be a surprise for the HR function. So I think there's also that pre-awareness of, right, we're expecting restructuring second half of this year. Let's start to have some key sessions with our people managers to remind them of certain skills and behaviours that we need.
Yeah. And again, I think it's interesting. I mean, there's sometimes, as Susan alluded to earlier, that sometimes we've got some legal constraints that mean we can't really talk about that as much as we would like to, but nothing stops us developing the skills of our people managers, right? So that's definitely an opportunity. I mean, you preempted a question from me, Ffion, which was going to be about how important you think the people manager is in creating the experience for people.
I think it's essential because you often build a relationship with your people manager as a professional and then as a person as well. And your line manager or people manager should be the person that you can go to express things that you're finding tricky with your role, areas of development that you may need, and also your ambitions. Like, hey, I want your job in 6 months. How can I get there? And you want a people manager to, first of all, kind of love being a people manager and wanting to grow their team. So that goes back to getting the right behaviours in your leadership level. And then your experience with the HR function generally as an employee is very limited. You don't really speak to HR ever. It's all normally always driven for your line manager. So it is essential around that piece. But then we need to bring the managers on the journeys with us when we are creating new ways of working, new processes, new systems. We need to get them to be advocates and our change champions around all of this.
Listening to Ffion, there's some great ideas, and I think most organisations can anticipate at some point they might need to go through this process rather than waiting until, oh crikey, we're facing it. You can anticipate it, and whether you've got formalised trade unions or employee forums, you could talk in advance and just say, what should this experience feel like for our people, and almost be ready and gear those managers up in advance. Because I always think when people are being made redundant, quite often you're still attracting new skills at the front end of that HR life cycle. They're watching the rest of the organization are watching how people are being treated, and they'll decide whether to stay or not based on how some of their colleagues are being treated. So being ready is, I think, a good thing to do.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I just wonder, what does good look like? What is a good redundancy process, that, and particularly one, Susan, that kind of helps you then click into that kind of transition process with somebody? So what do you think they need in the process that helps them to have a smooth transition?
I think so. I guess when we're still in transition, there's some other points we could talk about once they've transitioned and they're with the outplacement provider. But during that transition process, I think it's having those safe spaces to talk with colleagues, having clear information that they can take home. Quite often, this is a pressure for whole families. So actually giving people information in a format that they can take home and discuss and share with their families, I think is helpful. And sometimes written information, then everybody's got the same script. That's often a big deal. I've broken the news to lots of people, and the first question is, how am I going to tell my partner? So equipping them to manage that, helping them really understand the financial aspects, because again, that's a place where people will go first of all. So the timeline, the financial implications, and then obviously the help and support from the outplacement provider, that actually there will be support along this journey. You can't get away from the fact that it's a tough decision, and in that moment this is going to be tough for somebody to hear, but I do think those things will help them deal with it and prepare them a little bit more.
Ffion.
Also, I'd like to say around the people left as well in the team. So say if there's a team of 4 and one's being made redundant, that's awful for the remaining 3 individuals, because not only do they feel survivor's guilt, they'll then think about, okay, is my job going to be safe in 6 months' time? And as you were saying, Susan, they'll be watching how their colleague is experiencing the process and understanding, okay, is this an organisation that I'd like to stay in? But often or not, the people that are left are more unlucky sometimes than the people that are going, because they are in this environment in the organisation that isn't pleasant, because the business isn't doing great. They're picking up more work. Often people around them are not engaged or happy. And then the people going, yes, it is a shock, but then they could find the job of their dreams in 1 month later and potentially get a nice payout for it. So I think there's also, when we think about this experience, the Wish Me Well process, also be cognizant of the individuals left in the organisation as well.
Yeah, there are many different factors, isn't there? It's not simple, kind of this person or these collective of people are now being moved out of the business. There's inside the business, there's out of the business afterwards as well. We are just out of time, but I'm going to let Susan, because I can see that she's eager just to give us some final thoughts. Susan, I just want to get you building on that. And then unfortunately, that's it for the day.
Thanks. Just a point building on what Ffion said, quite often there is a voluntary redundancy process. How that is managed internally is pivotal, because I've been in lots of situations where typically a skill group might be at risk. And unfortunately, those organisations who use that as a performance management exercise rather than a redundancy process, that will go down really badly. Quite often people, like Ffion said, leave with big packages, but they are the ones who've not performed as well. And actually their colleagues who've worked super hard for 20, 30 years are retained because they're an asset, and colleagues in the same skill group get the payout. That must be performance managed in a separate process. Don't let the redundancy management process do that for you.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point as well. And that is just about time for today's podcast. Really, really fascinating one. Certainly, it's been great to have Susan on, and Ffion making her podcast debut. So, Susan, thank you very much for joining us.
Big pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I loved it. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we'll get you back on there. We'll get you back on and co-host Debbie. Always good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, of course, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And hopefully you've enjoyed it. Give us some feedback. Why don't you write a nice review on like Apple Podcast or something like that? That'd be nice. We always do like a nice review or two. But from myself, from Susan, from Ffion, and from Debbie, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully we'll see you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.